Hello, I'm Soren Brage from the University of Cambridge, and in a moment I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tessa, who's going to present our work on the impact of the lockdown on physical activity in England. However, beforehand, just a little bit of context. So the Black Death came to England in the mid 14th century, and over the next 300 years we had about 40 outbreaks of the plague, followed by other outbreaks of other infectious diseases, such as smallpox and cholera. And those were really the main causes of death in historic times. From the mid 19th century or so, we see a remarkable increase in life expectancy, however, from a level of about 40 years to about 80 years in more modern times. There's some notable dents in that, most prominently the one caused by the Spanish flu in 1918. As you may know, it was the second wave of the Spanish flu that claimed the most lives, and sadly, that was also the case for COVID deaths in the United Kingdom. The map shows the distribution of COVID deaths in England and Wales, and if we compare that to the map of child mortality 170 years earlier in England and Wales, we see some striking similarities here, and this really points to there might be some underlying causes that are similar in increasing disease susceptibility between these otherwise very different outcomes. In terms of what we might do about the problem, well, in the absence of effective treatment or vaccination, there really are only very few things we could do. And as was the case in historic times, these include quarantine and the restriction of movement of people and goods, and then the use of protective equipment such as face coverings. The top drawing there showing a man trying to protect himself against cholera, for example, and the bottom drawing there shows John Snow with his map having identified the Broad Street pump as the source of contaminated water that caused cholera, and the police officers there breaking off the handle so that those people living there would have to get their water from somewhere else. Now, a lockdown is one of our most extreme public health measures in order to slow down the transmission of disease, and whilst it might be effective in doing that, it may also potentially have some negative consequences. So turning our attention to physical activity, the world map here shows the decline in physical activity measures as measured by Fitbit data, and the lines there on the right shows several countries and the timelines of them in terms of smartphone detected steps. And we certainly see some declines across the board of these objective data. And whilst these data sources are certainly very valuable, they're unlikely to be nationally representative, and they can't tell us anything about subgroups who indeed may be less likely to own such devices and indeed be more vulnerable to the impact of extreme public health measures. So with that, I'm going to turn the baton over to Tessa.
Hi, my name is Tessa Strain. I work at the MLC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge, and I'm really grateful for the invite today to talk about our work on the impact of a national lockdown on physical activity levels in England. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the restrictions that we've been under for the last year and a half. As you can see, we've had periods of rather strict lockdowns with some restrictions in between. The first lockdown was introduced at the end of March 2020, and the restrictions in between and the subsequent lockdowns have varied quite a lot in content in terms of what was restricted and where they applied. But this first lockdown was universal in England, and our work focuses on this period. The instructions at the time were that the whole population needed to stay at home, and there were just a few exceptions for this: to shop for necessities, for medical needs, to travel to work where it was absolutely necessary, and for one bout of daily exercise. But all sports facilities and non-essential shops were closed. The data we're using comes from the Active Life Survey, which has been running continuously for about the last 5 years. It is huge in terms of sample size. We have data from over 170,000 adults, that's over 16 years of age, annually. And it's random probability sampled, so it's then weighted on demographic characteristics so that it is representative of the population in England. It's pushed to web as a design, which means participants are sent a letter that directs them online to the questionnaire, but they can complete a paper option if they prefer. This has been really critical because other surveys in the UK rely on face-to-face interviews, and that has had to obviously stop during the lockdowns. So this is the only national survey able to continue uninterrupted through this period. The physical activity data is really detailed. It's recall in the past 4 weeks, and they collect data on frequency, duration, and intensity of really specific activity types. It's non-occupational, so it involves travel activity and leisure activity. There's also some data on just participation, so not the detailed frequency, intensity, duration, but just participation in the specific activities for a longer time frame than just the last month. But I'll go into that in more detail as we use this data in our work. There are also questions on demographic and geographic characteristics, which we use as both stratifiers in this analysis and adjust for as potential confounders. Jumping straight into the results, I'll just show you this overview of mean activity levels over the sort of 5 years of data collection. And what we have here is obviously the sort of 12 months of the year, but different lines for the different years from 2015 to 2020, with the lightest colour being the 2015 furthest away from now, and the darkest being 2020. And immediately you can see that this month, the fourth period of the year, respondents that took the survey in April to May, so their recall period was that March to April lockdown, that the activity levels, mean minutes per week, are considerably lower than we'd expect for that time of year. What this next slide shows is the composition of that mean minutes of activity for the month of interest, that lockdown month, across the 5 years of data we have, so 2016 through to 2020. And the first thing I think to note is that the bar for 2020 is lower, as we saw in the previous chart. But starting at the top, we can see that dark blue colour is gardening, and we can see how that actually has really increased in 2020. And so if we were not including gardening, then the drop would be even greater between the previous 4 years and 2020. But moving down into other categories, it's obvious that team sports, or those relying on facilities, have all reduced a lot. So that's the light blue of team sports. The swimming and diving is the dark purple that's gone. The light purple is other sport and leisure activities. And the red of fitness and the sort of pinky golf have all gone down in size compared with the previous 4 years. Walking at the bottom there, it may be covered by my picture. The light grey is walking for travel and the dark is walking for leisure. So you can see walking for leisure has actually increased, although there was an upward trend through the previous 4 years. But walking for travel has really significantly decreased. None of these are unexpected, given the restrictions we were under, but it is interesting to quantify and to see the data on it. Having just presented a load of mean values, I'm now going to tell you why that's not the best way to summarise the data. Here in this slide, I'm showing you the frequency density distributions of non-occupational physical activity across the 5 years of data. And what's immediately obvious is that it's non-normally distributed. We have a huge spike of zeros, as is common in self-report data. And then the rest of the distribution is actually more like a gamma kind of distribution. But essentially, if you take a mean value, that's not going to fully capture what's going on in terms of changes between 2020 and the previous 4 years, which is our main research question. So what we've decided to do based on looking at these histograms is to split our regressions into two. Firstly, we were going to look at logistic regression, a binary indicator of people who report no activity and those that report some activity. Next, we were going to drop all the people that only reported 0 and get rid of that spike. And so we could just look at those that were reporting any activity. And then we could use a gamma model to look at differences in the mean duration of activity there. And here are the results of those regressions. Actually, the first panel is just prevalence. It's showing the proportions or the percentage of each subgroup that is reporting any activity in 2020 and 2016 to 19, the average of those 4 years. The second panel is the logistic regression of that. So it's trying to quantify the difference between 2020 and the previous 4 years, trying to show which subgroups were more affected than others. And then the last panel is a comparison of the duration of activity. So going back to the first panel to just talk about that in more detail, we can see that the navy dots are reflecting 2020 and the orange are the previous 4 years. And we can see that the navy dots are always to the left. They're always lower than the previous 4 years. So regardless of subgroup, we can see that the proportion reporting any activity was lower in 2020. To see which groups were more affected in 2020 than others, so essentially trying to quantify that difference between the orange and the navy dots, how wide apart those dots are, that's what that middle panel is doing. And so the further away the odds ratio is from the null, which is the vertical black dotted line, the bigger the difference in 2020. That's potentially, if we interpret it this way, that lockdown has had a greater effect. And immediately I want to pull out the youngest age groups as being the age groups that actually seem to have been most affected by lockdown. Okay, if we look to the first panel, they have the highest levels to start with, but it seems that it's almost like the inequality between the age groups got normalized in 2020, because the younger age groups were brought down so much more. And if we look to the students who are often in this age category, we see pretty much the same result there. I don't want to ignore the final column of the mean durations, but they can be hard to interpret. In this case, we see a lower mean duration in 2020 compared with 2016 to 19. So we can pretty much say that it's not only that more people are not doing any activity, those that are in these age groups, those that are doing activity seem to have done less in 2020 compared with other years. So across the board, the distribution has shifted in these age groups. Picking up on another characteristic here, we've got ethnicity, and we can see that the non-white ethnicities seem to have been more affected by lockdown than others. And the unemployed are also a group that I want to pull out as seemingly having been more affected in 2020 than other subgroups. I'm now going to show you essentially the same results, but for walking only as opposed to total activity. So on the left, we've got walking for leisure, and on the right, we've got walking for travel. I've missed out the third panel on each of the figures just because that's more complex to interpret, and just want to keep to the main story here, because they're kind of contrasting as to what's happened in walking for leisure and walking for travel in 2020. You can see that walking for leisure, that the navy dots are all higher than the orange dots, showing that people were more likely to be walking for leisure in 2020 than the previous 4 years in this lockdown period. And that's reflected by the odds ratios all being just in and around 1, slightly above 1. Whereas walking for travel has completely the opposite trend. There are large differences, huge differences, reflecting a really big drop in those participating in walking for travel in this first month of lockdown. And the odds ratios are sort of 0.3, so that's 70% lower odds of participating in this activity in 2020. I've not really got time to go into other activities, but as you can imagine from the one of the early slides I showed you on gardening increasing, that has a similar pattern to walking for leisure. In fact, it's potentially more stark, and it's particularly evident in the oldest age groups, which may explain why they were less affected in the overall data than some of the younger age groups who potentially don't have access to gardens in the UK. They're not homeowners by this stage in life. I'm moving on now to some data I referred to right at the beginning about the trajectories of participation in the 3 months prior to interview. Respondents were asked these series of questions, which I'll go through and explain how we got to different categories for the respondents. So respondents were asked, have you participated in a specific activity, so for example, football or walking for travel, in the 3 months prior to interview? And if they said no, that was a really obvious trajectory. It's just no participation at all. That's fairly straightforward. But if they said yes, they were then asked a subsequent question, which was, have they participated in the last 4 weeks? So if someone said yes to that question, then what we know about them is they definitely participated in the last 4 weeks. We don't actually really know what they did in the 2 to 3 months prior to interview, but we know they participated in the last 4 weeks. But if they said no to that second question, then what we know is they've done something in the 2 to 3 months beforehand, but they stopped in the last 4 weeks. So what this will enables us to look at is, in our case, people who were doing an activity in sort of January, February time, and then stopped in this month, which coincided with lockdown. And this figure now shows the proportions in those categories across all the different activity types. If we start with looking at any activity, and this is the top left 2 bars, take the 2016 to 19 bar as being a reflection on typical churn in activity levels on a typical year. So we expect about 6% to never do anything in the first 3 months of the year. That's basically this recall period. We expect about 92% to have done something in the last 4 weeks. And we expect about 2% to have stopped in the last 4 weeks, having done something previously in January, February time. And that could have stopped for any old reason, but that's a sort of typical churn in activity levels at an individual level. So when we see in 2020, we see this as being actually quite different. We see that proportion who have stopped activity going up to almost 6%. And we see the proportion doing no activity in the past 3 months going up a bit too. So this is generally complementing our previous analyses and showing, yes, it does seem like, even when we're looking at individual trajectories, that activity levels have gone down in the population. And when we look across the different sport types or sport and exercise activities, we do see the same trends. We see walking for travel, a lot of people having had to stop that in the last 4 weeks, and those activity types that rely on other people or facilities also being quite affected, particularly if you look at the light grey bar at the top. I will highlight walking for leisure because that is a slightly odd result to interpret. It seems like more people stopped that, 6.8% compared with the previous 4 years. 4.3%. But it does seem, when you look at the proportion that have no participation, that's gone down. So it's a complex story here. It implies there may be general trends in activity and walking for leisure that are going up, so there's potentially more people are doing it, then more people are able to stop doing the activity as well. So it's not an easy one to interpret, but in general, these results are complementing what we saw before. To conclude, our results are strongly indicating that the pandemic-related lockdown reduced population levels in England in the spring of 2020. The impacts were not uniform across subgroups, and they also varied by activity type. And the two interacted. It's likely that some of the subgroups that were most affected relied heavily on some of the activity types that were most affected. So the younger age groups were probably more participated more in the team sports, and that had to stop. So the pandemic may have created new, or it may have exacerbated old inequalities. And particularly of interest is access to green space and gardening. We saw that increase, but that actually was driven, I didn't show these data, but it was driven quite a lot by the middle to older age groups. And so that's something to consider for activity promotion policies in the future. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, the funding that we receive, and all of those that responded to the survey and have been involved in curating the data. Thank you very much for listening.